We're going. All right.
Okay. I welcome you all to the semifinals of the University of Massachusetts Debate Tournament, edition 2009, and I call this house to order. I hereby recognize the Honorable Prime Minister, invite him to stand up and deliver us an address defending the motion which stands in his name as soon as I designate somebody as a timer, which I forgot to do. Would you like to time? Sure. Okay. Here, here.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So one of my favorite shows I like to watch in the news times is CSI. And in CSI, they usually always crack the case, usually 30 minutes to an hour, using, moreover, genetic or DNA-founded evidence. So it always seems that there's always some DNA. We think with this motion, we're taking the fictitious CSI and making it into ultimate reality. We think that we have, in this motion, we have a special privilege, Mr. Speaker, to stop and limit crimes from happening. So what we think here is we have a mechanism where we already have where we will allow and attach DNA recognition to any child born, either with hair samples, skin samples, things like this. But moreover, the people that are already born today, like you and me and everyone else in this room, will have also a sort of coming back and registering the DNA through things like similar things like registering for a driver's license, registering to vote, or registering for a passport. We see that we already have a precedent set, Mr. Speaker, on tracking people and keeping people in databases. We see in the status quo, like biometric chips in passports. So we see that we've already created this trust with our government and saying that we think that our national security is safer when we collect and have people collect a database necessarily that have tracking devices on it. So moving over, we also see that DNA is a hot issue today in today's world. That we see the Human Genome Project that's pretty much close to completing the mapping out the human DNA mapping. So this is a huge thing, and it's a new thing that we think in this point in time in technology that we need to use to solve crime. Sure. But moreover, why do we deem this necessary? We think that crimes that leave DNA, Mr. Speaker, usually leave them more serial in nature. That people are affected moreover, like things like rape that leave numerous amounts of DNA. That these will harm more people than just one person. And we think that this is unique, that DNA is unique because it provides the most substantial evidence in a court case, and it has minimal error. We do realize, yes, you can get DNA off and wrong sometimes, but it's the best one out of things like eyewitnesses that are usually biased or usually by perspective only. We think by using this hard science of DNA, we can solve crimes, and we think there's immediate danger, especially in things like crimes of rape that are happening serially. Before I go ahead.
Okay, so but aren't these individuals who are caught for raping, or where their DNA is already in the system, so why are we going to persecute all of Americans?
And this is great. It moves right into my two substantial points, and it's the nature of criminal investigations and the realm of privacy. And my partner will talk about this national security implications of this motion and how we can stay safe by doing this. So like I said, this moves right into it. This is the nature of criminal investigation. This is not accusing people of all being crimes. But we think that everyone does have an ability to be a criminal in some point in time in their lives. But moreover, that you can actually use this DNA to help investigations. If they find a piece of my hair at a criminal scene, then I was obviously, or could have been there, and I could actually progress the investigation by when they recognize that I was there to do that. So we're not accusing everyone of being criminals. We do recognize the possibility that everyone can commit crimes, but moreover, we think we could get a benefit of this because even if you didn't commit the crime, but DNA was found at the criminal site, that you can help the investigation, you can save a life, and you can better the nature in the criminal investigation. Moving over, No, thank you. So, moving on now to my second argument, and this is the realm of privacy. So, we're going to preempt this, and they're going to say, well, this is, the privacy is incurring on our rights of privacy. But, like I said, we already created this precedent of, biometric chips, and we think that, moreover, that this DNA does not really fall into the realm of privacy. We think that your biological genetic makeup is not really who you are, what you do, and that's really what privacy is. We think that that if they find my DNA, that they know that I'm a black male, it's not really incurring on my privacy. We think that this is that with this motion and the DNA specifically, that we have the ability to not really incur on it, but progress the investigation. I'll take you to see him.
It is a violation because, well, let them tap my phone because I'm having a conversation with a friend that I'm going to go see a football game. It's not really a violation of my privacy because I'm going to go watch a football game. It's the moral of it. It's the rule.
Yeah, once again, I'm saying that this is, when you're going to a football game is what you're doing. Your DNA does not show what you're doing. It just shows you your genetic makeup. This is your biology we're talking about here. It's not about your identity. So we don't think that, we do think that this is it's not incurring on the right to privacy, but it's providing security in our society by speeding up these criminal investigations, by saving lives in crimes that usually hurt more lives than just one. No, thank you. So just to go into the encasing and summarization of this, what we have so far in the model, we think that we've already had a set of precedent, biometric chips and things like that. We think that there's a sense of security already in the status quo of keeping that large databases, and we think that the benefit of keeping these large databases is to classify people and to find out where and who has actually been at a crime scene. We think this is necessary. That, like I said, that crimes that leave the DNA are usually the most harmful. That they are serial things like rape and we can save more lives than one by recognizing and enacting this policy. Moreover, we think that unique sort of object of DNA being, the most substantial evidence that is provided in court cases is something that we need to recognize and use to provide justice to society. We think that, this is the nature of criminal investigations, that, we're not accusing everyone of being in crime. We do recognize that everyone can commit crime. Moreover, that we think there's the possibility of stopping more crimes by enacting this policy, and that we don't think your genetic makeup falls into the realm of privacy. Don't let them say this because it's simply not true. Your genetic makeup is just who you are, not what you're doing, what is privacy. So with all these reasons, Mr. Speaker, you must side with the first government here and save more lives than one and provide justice to the society. Thank you.
I thank the Speaker for his eloquent remarks. I now call upon the Leader of the Opposition to open up the opposition's case.
All right, just as a brief roadmap, I'm going to go ahead and go into some points of refutation on what the atrocities that government has decided to bring up today. I'm going to go into some new matter of my own. So let's go ahead and look at the model that government has decided to give us today. And look at some of their points that they've brought up. They talk about it's the nature of criminal investigation, and this is actually going to help, right? Wrong. Because what we're actually doing is incriminating all Americans. So let's just go ahead and take their DNA, the very essence of who they are, and stick into a database. I mean, there's no actual warrant for this. And furthermore, government has not simply identified the problem that we have. It's not like we have everyone out there killing each other all the time. They haven't even told us what exactly the problem is. Again, when they say that this is going to help in the course of criminal investigation, what they fail to realize is that criminals who have already been caught and persecuted, that their DNA is already in the database. They're already fingerprinted. They're already in a database that local authorities have access to. And so this is the reason why we don't necessarily need this, because we're not trying to incriminate all Americans. We just want to go ahead and persecute the individuals who have already committed crimes. So, no, thank you. And furthermore, government has already conceded that DNA at times may be wrong, and that it is something it may be flawed. And this is exactly the point of the argument: is that you can't incriminate regular individuals when DNA is not 100% accurate. So I'm going to go ahead and hit on some of my points of new matter, since it kind of directly ties into what First Government has already brought up. So they talk about the realm of privacy, and I want to talk to you today about the founding principles of our nation, about these democratic ideas of our rights, of civil liberties. And so we already know that that kind of enacting on other people's individual rights is bad. And I'll give you numerous examples. When FDR put all the Japanese in these concentration camps during World War II. That was bad, right? We encroached on their civil liberties. Again, when Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War suspended the right of habeas corpus, we know that we don't look at that as a very good thing. And more recent example, the Patriot Act. We already know that by wiretapping phones, people see this as an encroachment on their civil liberties. And so this is all just kind of a link to this suspicion, and furthermore, elaborating on it as the Patriot Act, even though we've wiretapped lots of Americans' homes, there's never actually been an arrest on U.S. soil because of this wiretapping. So we're just encroaching on liberties, and we're not really solving the problem, which is exactly what the government is bringing up today. I'll go ahead and take you with that.
But don't you agree that, perhaps we can use these DNA databases to, it's not personally, it just identifies who the person is, does not identify what
no. The
doing.
point of the matter is that we have to look at the moral principles in today's debate. What they're trying to tell you is that it's okay if we take a couple hairs, it's not that big of a deal, but the point of the matter, it's the principles of it. We have the right to civil liberty, and furthermore, we have the right to our own bodies, which brings me to, no thank you, which brings me to my next point, the right of the individual body. And I'm going to give you two examples of this perfect, I'm going to give you one example, and Party's going to elaborate further. I want to look specifically at Roe versus Wade. We know that the Supreme Court already ruled that women have the right to their own bodies. They can do with it as they please, so why should we allow the government to just simply take our DNA and throw it in this database, since there's already this historical principle of individuals having the right over their own body? I'll take you.
Wouldn't you agree that the government already documents the status of the body in a driver's license with your eye color, your height?
No, but no, you're kind of trying to confuse this whole licenses versus a DNA database. There's not really any correlation there. As hard as you might try, you're kind of a dead horse that you keep kicking. So lastly, as my point of new matter, I want to go ahead up and talk about utilitarianism and why this is inherently bad. And so we know that in utilitarianism, it's the rights of the majority versus the rights of the minority. And what I want to talk to you a little bit about today is looking back at history and looking back at what we've already talked about. We know that at one point in our history that it was bad for blacks to have any rights at all, for African Americans to have the right to vote, and also for women to have the right to vote. And that was a utilitarian concept. It was the rights of the majority of whites versus the rights of the minority, which were the blacks. And this is something that inherently was very bad. And we can already see that we've already discussed this, and we already see that it's bad, so we've already had this historical precedence of utilitarianism and why it doesn't work in today's society. So furthermore, I want to go ahead and talk about the practicality of the model that the government has decided to bring up today. So they talked about this database, but they really told us, how is it going to work? How do we account for the undocumented individuals who live within the United States, which are a big perpetuate the cycle of crime? How are you going to ensure that these illegal immigrants get into this database? How is that going to actually help us incriminating criminals? I mean, it's not really solving for anything. You say that we're going to require kind of adults to go register, kind of like driver's license. What they fail to realize is that a lot of these undocumented individuals don't have driver's license, so they're not going to have any reason to go put their DNA in this database. So we can see that this is already inherently flawed. No, thank you. So we're going to, now let's look at what is it actually, how will this actually hurt us? So we're going to see that there could be some kind of harms on the job section of American society. We already know that we have policemen who go out and investigate these crimes, right? So what happens when if everybody just relies on, oh, there's a DNA database, we'll just go ahead and look for DNA and see if that solves anything. It's not fixing the problem. Again, talking about the practicality of this issue, we look at contamination and of these samples. So we can see that this DNA system is not perfect. It doesn't always work. So why are we going to encroach on the liberties of all U.S. citizens for this system that is inherently flawed? And this is exactly what we need to keep looking at in today's debate. I guess I'll go ahead and take a question.
On contamination, we also have eyewitness key accounts that are contaminated. And also
I understand what you're saying, but the point of the matter is that having an eyewitness account that someone who's actually witnessed this crime is different from just putting all Americans' DNA into these databases. It's inherently bad. So we also need to look at the practicality issue of who will have access to this database. How are we going to ensure that it's going to actually work to the benefit of all Americans? How are we going to ensure that it's going to be regulated? Who's going to look after this? And how is it going to work? And we also have this issue of secondary transfer. Although your DNA might end up on a scene, but you weren't necessarily there because you knew somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody. So we see this is the practicality issues that DNA is kind of one of these touchy subjects that we don't really need to go into. So I'm going to go ahead and summarize what I've already brought to the table today. So we already know that if we're looking at this strictly as a voting issue, we already know that the founding principles in which this country is founded on, these civil liberties with a right to due process, specifically innocent until proven guilty, these are exactly what we need to look at in today's debate. We know that our government's plan is encroaching on our rights of these founding principles, these liberties. And we already know that utilitarianism is bad. And we already see that the rights of the majority should not always supersede the rights of the minority, that we each have the right to these founding principles and to these civil liberties, and this is exactly what opposition stands for in today's debate. Thank you.
I thank the Leader of Opposition for her eloquent remarks. And now, the Chair now recognizes the Deputy Prime Minister and invites her to continue the case for the government side.
Mr. Speaker, civil liberties are exactly what government is standing for today. And I'm going to show you how in my substantial matter when I talk about the importance, and this is going to sound a little bit like last night's debate, but where national security is essential to we need to make sure that this isn't questioned, that this isn't a problem, so that we don't have to take away civil liberties in the future. Now, what I want to do first is I want to rebuild my partner's case, and then I want to talk about what we got. We had an awful lot of matter from Leah, wonderful name by the way, and then I want to go into my point about terrorism and how this is an important battle with terrorism. And I know this sounds a little bit like last night's debate, but I'm going to show it to you and it's going to be beautiful. So first of all, he said, we're not accusing people. And Leah rightly so got up here and said, well, of course you're accusing people. No, we're still not. Because when we ask for example, for your, and this is linked very closely to, is this your biology or is this your identity? When we ask for a picture on a driver's license, we're saying, what do you look like? This is exactly what your DNA is, ladies and gentlemen. Your DNA is what do you look like? What skin color do you have? What color are your eyes? What kind of hair do you have? Is your smile great or everything like that? This is what you look like. It is your biology. This does not decide who you are. If we believe that in our society, then we're pretty much drones to our nature. That's not something that our society wants to buy into. We believe in the individuality of a person and the freedom to choose. This is something that government stands for. No, thank you. So this fact that that we're accusing everyone immediately is the same thing as asking someone to stand for a photograph. We're asking them to do that as a child. We're taking a piece of their hair. We're not taking a piece of their soul, Mr. Speaker. Okay. No, thank you. He also said that anyone is capable of making bad choices, and this can actually help. If you are located at a crime scene, you can come in and help us when we're fighting to find out who was responsible for the crime that went on. Now, she said, well, you're accusing people immediately, and we already have all the offenders in the databases. Like we can't get new ones? I don't understand that. So we already know who all the rapists are, who all the future murderers are? Absolutely not. It's ridiculous. Now, he also then he talked about the identity versus the biology, and I've clearly stated that. She said we needed to establish a problem. We have a problem. We have serial child molesters. We have serial rapists. We have killers in general. We have civil liberties that are going to be taken away if our national security is threatened. They have to be suspended, and this is something that we want to protect. This is preempting a problem, but also dealing with the problem we have today. Now, I want to talk about her first point, civil liberties taken away. She said we have to prove that we're incriminating, and I already dealt with that, really. And then she said that Roe versus Wade, women have the right to their own body. Again, this is their biology. What Roe versus Wade was about is what I can decide to do to your body, to cause you, force you to have an abortion, or force you not to have an abortion. It's totally different, and it's not applicable here. I'm asking for what your body looks like. It's not your identity or a piece of your soul. And third, she went on to the rights of the majority versus the rights of the minority. When I have the DNA capable of capturing or locating, and this is another essential key that has to be made very clear. We're not stating that we're always going to use only DNA in court cases. This is coupled along with eyewitness statements. This is to collaborate with alibis and other evidence pieces that we already use. So that's very important to note as well. So when we have the DNA to help along with the process of criminal prosecution, then this is protecting society. This is why we have courts and police officers in the first place, to protect the majority from those minority who are criminals. So in this case, the utilitarian argument is on our side. Now, she talked about the practicality and the fact that undocumented or illegal people won't be able to be in this process. Just because we can't get everybody doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. And this can be, we can work towards it. She said job loss because policemen won't have work. We're still using them for looking for alibis, eyewitness. They can, work with the DNA to gather the DNA. Not even an important argument. All right, she said the contamination, and like I said before, we have bribed people who get on the stand and all sorts of other contamination. We're using them in collaboration, and we recognize that flaws happen. So we can, I think as human beings on the juries and judge stands, recognize this problem. No, thank you, Zia. Please don't pout at me. All right, so now I want to get into my substantial matter, and this is beautiful, Mr. Speaker. I want to talk about how terrorism undermines the social structure that is so necessary to our civil liberties. And this is not unique to terrorism specifically. This is also with crimes, with radical fundamentalism or hate crimes. What happens when we are living in fear? This damages our ability to take, no thank you, to take action or to take hold of the civil liberties that we already have. We can't live them if we are afraid for losing our lives in some point. Yes, Sam?
Wouldn't you agree that the system has to be infallible, meaning it should be 100% foolproof, so that's the only time we're going to violate a gross violation of all of our citizens of America?
So if we had a foolproof system, if we believed and bought into what Zia just said, we would never have or prosecute anyone in the court system, because we know that our court system has in the past prosecuted people who are found to be not guilty. So, I mean, I don't want to live in the world where we don't have courts. Secondly, when we talk about the people can't take advantages of their civil liberties, and civil liberties are on the side of the government case here. Secondly, no thank you, the damages of threats to our national security. Now let's talk about, for example, just a few years ago, they found sleeper cells for radical fundamentalists in Eastern Oregon. I love Oregon to death. This was a bad part of Oregon's history. We recognize that this can happen in the U.S., that this can happen, it happens already in other parts of the world. No thank you, I'm sorry, Scott. And we want to, even though it might not be a massive problem in the U.S., we want to be able to preempt it if it does become a large problem. Because we recognize that if it does become a large problem, if we see something like the Mumbai attacks, or something like the Tamil Tigers, where we have a massive organization of people who are killing other people for radical fundamentalism, or hatred against another people group or race, or ideology, then we have to suspend, in some cases, those civil liberties for our national security. So we preempt this. We save civil liberties when we can better protect our national security by just taking a picture of what you look like. This to me sounds like a pretty good deal, Mr. Speaker. Now I want to talk about specifically the uniqueness of terrorism. Those actions that terrorists incur are pretty bad. What they're doing is pretty damaging to individual lives. Yes. In addition to that, the ideologies are worse. So it's important that immediacy is followed through. We cannot wait to look for a citizen and search through and wait for something else to happen to get a little bit more evidence. We have to act immediately. These ideas are poisonous. These ideas propagate more violence, and national security is then threatened even more, and more civil liberties potentially have to be suspended. Mr. Speaker, civil liberties fall on the side of the government. We believe that taking a picture of what you look like is important for this. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the Speaker very much for her eloquent remarks. The Chair now recognizes the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, invites him to continue the debate.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very glad to be here on behalf of this issue, one that is very near and dear to me and my heritage. And I want to pose a question that I will try to follow through with the debate. How does suspicion make you feel? How do you feel when there's always someone looking over your back, looking at your papers, looking at what you're doing? Do you act normally when that happens? If I came around the room right now and looked at everyone's paper, what everyone is thinking, how does that make you feel? Do you feel trustworthy in my intentions? Do you feel that you can act normally, that nobody is going to react to the situation? I highly doubt that's the case, because suspicion makes people cooperate differently, makes people feel differently, makes people act differently. So briefly, in my speech, I'm going to give a brief rebuttal, and then I'm going to talk about the culture of trust and the role of trust in the government, and I'm also going to talk about the fundamental human right to bodily integrity. So first, on some rebuttals, we've heard about how this, the DNA database is going to help the court system. But how can you cooperate in an investigation if you are the suspect, when everything you say or use could be held against you in a court of law? I highly doubt that you're going to be the most cooperative individual, because to be honest, you're going to be saving your own butt, because obviously the government doesn't think that you're capable of doing the right thing. No, thank you. They say that we can take the rights away from somebody when they no longer deserve them, but now what the government is saying, that let's take those rights away in the case that maybe they'll do something wrong. And obviously this is not what we were founded on, as my partner had brought up earlier. And then we hear this argument about identity versus biology, that taking a sample of your body is the same thing as taking a picture. But I cannot see the analogy, or I cannot see the similarity between cutting off your finger and taking your finger versus your fingerprint. This is inherently something very different from taking a part of your body versus taking an image or representation of that body. And that is where you are violating our human rights.
Sorry.
Yes, on that point.
So the difference between cutting your finger is you're bleeding, you have physical harm. When you put a fingerprint and put ink on it, there's no harm done. You're just part of a database, just like everyone in this room.
Exactly, but what they're saying is they're going to violate your body. They're going to invade your body and take a part of it, rather than an image, a representation, an identity. That's completely different than who you are in itself, who your blood is. And that is where we're making this distinction. And that's where you really begin to violate the human rights, and that you suspect everyone. And also, they made this terrorism argument, but they don't define the terrorism. They just say they're radicals. So now we can cast more suspicion on people who have radical beliefs, but there's many radicals out there in our nation, and we must respect them, because they're not all violent, but now they're just trying to make this schema that anyone who's radical is violent, and now we can cast more suspicion on them. So on to my point of new matter, which is the culture of trust. That they are creating an inherently negative view of people and humanity. And what I'm saying here is, if there is no trust in the government, there is no society left to govern. We are all suspects. No, thank you. I don't appreciate the barricade. We are just a society of suspects. We are a society of people who all have the ability to do harm. Then what is the point of having a society in the first place where we can cooperate and try and advance ourselves if all we're trying to do is to save our own butt from being incited in a crime? When the eye of suspicion is cast upon you, you feel different, and you know it. You're careful of what you say, you're careful of what you do, that you cannot act as you are. You do not have a right to your self-determination because somebody is out there thinking that whatever it is you're doing it wrong. And this is where the DNA database is so dangerous, because it takes away your rights before you have done anything to deserve that taking away. We imprison people. We take away the right to liberty and the right to freedom, but that's after they've committed a crime. Now, we say that even if it's against your religion, it's against the way you think or feel, we can still take your blood, we can take part of your body, and we can characterize it in a database and just give you a number, a new suspect number, and that's exactly what the government wishes you to do. Look at some of the extreme examples of Cuba, where people have no freedom. They are always suspects. They have a secret police, where everyone is cast a watchful eye. You can no longer say or do what you want in a peaceful manner, because somebody always thinks that it's done against the government or it's done to harm somebody else. And we've seen the moral degradation of the people in Cuba. We've also seen here in the United States that wiretaps and people have been falsely incriminated and have been sent to overseas CIA prisons and even tortured. And when they're finally released, when they say, oh, sorry, you weren't really the suspect we thought, you didn't fit our schema that we thought you did, you can't sue the government because the government is infallible. Yes, on that.
Isn't that the purpose of the DNA database, so we don't have to take those extreme measures, so we can prevent the crimes before they happen?
The problem is that if you're incited in any way in relation, even though it didn't actually occur, you just look at the number that's put on your back rather than the situation that actually occurred around you. Because they can use the DNA and twist it, because the DNA is only important because you can add any representation or any meaning you want. Because it's not an actual witness saying anything, it's just a number, and they already have a negative view that that number is going to commit a crime. No, thank you. And next, on to the right of your bodily integrity. This is a fundamental human right, and the government should not have agency over your body. We've talked about Roe v. Wade, and they're trying to twist it in a different example. But the government has no right to say what you do with your body and sacrifice it over. And one of the most horrible atrocities in American history was the Tuskegee experiment, where they took African-American individuals in the 1930s and told them that they would be trying to cure their problem of syphilis. Instead, they were just experimenting on them and allowed them to die without giving them any help to see what the progression of syphilis was. This violates the trust of the government that you don't know what their intentions are. There is no society. Those people were just objects. They were numbers. They were just people in a database. And this is exactly what they want to do. They want to put a number on you. You are a suspect. You are just a subject of the state, and they have agency over you. Clinton formally apologized years later for the atrocities that occurred, and this shows that one of our greatest presidents in American history that stood up for human rights, he said that this is not what our society is about. This is how it links in with my partner's first argument, that this is not what we stand for. We cannot violate the trust of our government, the trust that we should have in the people to have a real society. Otherwise, we're just a bunch of numbers. We're a bunch of bodies floating around that are all capable of doing harm. And this is not the view we should take on our society. This is a step back in human development. This is a step away from humanity and looking at people as good human beings. If you only see negative, if you only perceive negative, all you will experience is negative. All you experience is hate and distrust, discrimination, and violation of people's human rights. So ladies and gentlemen, I urge you, I beg you to oppose this motion. It is a very dangerous consequence to treating us all as suspects. Thank you very much.
I thank the speaker very much for his eloquent remarks, and I invite the next speaker to please continue the debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This House would establish DNA databases for all citizens for the purpose of criminal investigations because it is a means that we can use to prove empirically the identity claims of all individuals objectively. I will further go into this by saying that DNA databases help combat the ever-present threat of identity theft in America today and can be concretely seen when just looking at statistics of individuals. And I will also illuminate a second point, which is that DNA databases will work to mitigate racial profiling and cultural prejudice, which will fall under the description of the ideals on which our country was founded. But first, I would like to go into some refutation of the previous speaker. The first thing I picked up on the previous speaker's, in the previous speaker's speech was his point that this action would violate human rights. But I would also like to pose that I do believe racial profiling and identity theft also violates human rights. I would just like to make that point. And also, he brought up the point that no trust in government equals no society, and that we're all a society of suspects, and that the government is increasingly infringing on our privacy and causing all this anxiety over privacy. Well, what about a criminal looking into my privacy and stealing my identity, taking my money, and using it to buy other things, using my identity to enter other countries unlawfully? What about that infringement of privacy? The government is responsible to defend individuals from unlawful acts, and we believe that establishing DNA databases is a way that we can objectively define the identity of every single individual. Okay, well now I'd like to go into my own role. Yes?
So if you have a DNA database, how does this deal, or how does this prevent a guy on the internet from taking your identity?
Okay, I understand that, and I will go on to say this further, but I'll just say that you can prove your own identity by using your own biological traits that are entered into a system so that people know that you are who you are because there's biological basis for it. Okay, well anyway, moving on to my points of illumination. DNA databases help combat the ever-present threat of identity theft. And this is seen on a regular basis. We see it on 2020, we see it in the news, we hear it from our next door neighbors. Now, on a global level, identity theft is very, very fear-inspiring, especially under the increasing threat of global terrorism. The events of 9/11 are all I need to point to illuminate this. I mean, the terrorists hijacked a plane, and they got on this plane by assuming identities that weren't even theirs. Tell me, how could we let this happen? How could the government let this happen? We did not even have any idea this was coming. And on a global level, as we can see, the very harmful benefits of not having DNA to substantiate the identities of these terrorists before they went on this plane. However, on a domestic level, I would also like to include that individuals are constantly at risk for having their economic assets seized unlawfully by imposters. This is an age of credit cards and debit cards. As college students, we all know that, and it's just a sign of the name when we're out the door. We're constantly moving, we're constantly spending, we have places to be, and this is a very fast-paced world that we live in. And unfortunately, there are not enough credit card companies that are held accountable for identity theft. How would you feel if one day you looked into your bank account and saw $0.00? That is your entire life's assets taken away. What are we doing to these criminals? How are we judging whether or not they are who they say they are? With DNA databases, we will make sure that assets are not unlawfully seized by people who should not even be granted this information. No, not right now, thank you. I would like to move on to my next point, which is that DNA databases will work to mitigate racial profiling and cultural prejudice, to which I would like to use the opposing arguer's phrase, how does suspicion make you feel? No, not right now, thank you. Well, I can tell you how suspicion makes me feel, and a lot of other people feel when they enter an airport. By using DNA databases, we will be able to eliminate no-fly lists, and the social humiliation that occurs on behalf of Arabs, African Americans, no, not right now, and suspected others in airports. I mean, even me as a Caucasian female, I'm still subject to questioning. I can only imagine what it's like to be of Arab descent. I have to walk through airport security, have constant eyes staring at me as I'm just trying to go visit my grandma. You know what? This will work against social injustice. No, not right now, thank you. This will work against social injustice and will help people the mobility to go where they want to go without being falsely accused or have prejudice held against them. And also, I would just like to add that this will also work as a preventative measure against the security mishaps that preceded 9/11. And being too liberal with their ideas about identity, taking everyone's word for granted, letting terrorists enter a plane under the assumed identity of false individuals. No, thank you. Also, I would like to give a secondary follow-up to that. In that innocent individuals will no longer be put under scrutiny in public arenas if we use DNA databases. If anything, DNA databases will work to further protect civil liberties. It grants protections to all individuals from identity theft, from being falsely accused and falsely suspected in airports and other public areas. It grants protections to all individuals from police officials who have been known to sometimes make false assumptions or to have just been simply misled. It restores the services of the police force to that which protects the innocent, not wrongly accusing and humiliating them. And that is something that our country has held highly ever since its inception. It's the protection of the innocent. And with these DNA databases, the innocent will be proven innocent. There will be a biological basis in which everyone can define whether or not they're an innocent individual or perhaps a terrorist waiting to get on a plane, blow it up. I mean, honestly, just looking at it on a domestic level, no one wants their identity theft. No one wants to lose all of their money. No one wants to not be able to go into an airport and just safely get on the plane. And at the same time, on a global level, this is a preventative measure to stop global terrorism, to prevent terrorists from stepping onto planes and endangering more lives. So that's why I urge you to vote in favor. Thank you.
I thank the speaker very much for her remarks. I now call upon the member of the opposition to open up the case for the closing opposition.
Thank you for the floor, Mr. Speaker. You know, as I listened to the previous speaker go on, and to a lesser extent the earlier government teams, I'm reminded of my favorite Steely Dan song, I'm a fool to do your dirty work. And I'm so happy she brought up this terrorism example because it segues so perfectly into the extension I bring to you today, Mr. Speaker. And I'm going to apologize in advance as I have to resort to a cliche, but these terrorists that the government speaker is so concerned about, these people who attack us, well, they hate us for our freedom. They hate us for the very civil liberties that we as Americans possess. That is what they're going after, and that is what they are attacking. Now, When we turn around and collect all of our citizens and make them submit to this DNA sample, because, again, for fear of terrorism, we are doing the terrorists' dirty work. We're doing their bidding, and we're enabling them to succeed in their mission. So that's the extension, and that's the one point you must realize today. No, thank you, not right now. No, not right now, let me finish. So that's the point you must realize. We are doing their bidding, and we are violating these so important civil liberties. And to a lesser extent, my next new matter, my next substantive material, when you take away these civil liberties, what do? We are a melting pot of a country. We have so many different cultures assimilated into this nation and into this group of people. And what you do, know that you take this multiculturalism, and you violate it. Amish people don't even want pictures taken of them. And do you think they're going to go in there and submit to a DNA test? Do you think a Muslim man is going to take his young daughter and have another person touch her and swab her mouth? No. So much for the melting pot, so much for multiculturalism, so much for the ideals that we built this country on. We're going to be violating them. But now let's get into some refutation. And the first speaker got up here. Actually, let me mention one more thing. We have precedent for not doing this, Mr. Speaker. We have precedent over the past 100 years since fingerprinting technology has been developed. There's a reason why we haven't fingerprinted every citizen in the nation, even after terrorist attacks, even after the Oklahoma City bombing, after the U.S. Cole, after the World Trade Center attacks, both of them. There's a reason we didn't violate that, and it's what the first opposition said. Talk about that violation of your bodily rights and the violation of certain inherent principles and liberties that we as Americans have. Now, let's get into some refutation. Let's talk about, no thank you, not right now, what the first member of government said, the Prime Minister. He talked about CSI. And you know what, that's my favorite, it's not really my favorite show, but I know so much about it. Okay, yes. You know what they also do on CSI? That people plant DNA, okay? Because it's much easier to plant DNA than it is to, say, plant someone's fingerprint. 100 hairs fall off our head a day, so I can pick up someone's brush, take a hair off that, put it on a crime scene, and that would automatically make them a person of interest in that crime. No, we can't have that. No, thank you. And he talks about passports. Well, he says, oh, we submit to passports, and we have chips and passports, so clearly there's precedent for this. Well, you know why we have those chips and passports? Because they're forged easily, because you can get fake passports. So that's the reason for those chips. It doesn't set a precedent for this. Go ahead.
Identity also is forged easily, so.
Okay, that brings me to my next rebuttal. Your partner came up here and went on an extended diatribe about identity theft. Now, first of all, I don't see how this is really relevant, because we're talking about certain criminal investigations, so she didn't really tie that in that well. But you really contradict yourself when you realize we're going to have this massive database of DNA under your logic, because this is your logic, I don't see the logic, but you're going to have a massive database of DNA, and you're going to have workers from the government, they didn't really say how many, 10, a dozen, hundreds, thousands, with access to this DNA. So really, what this is going to do is open the door to more identity theft as you see it happening. No, thank you, not right now. Okay, so when more people have access to this DNA, which you seem to think somehow leads to identity theft, that's what's going to happen. And more importantly, you can assume someone's identity, but you can't really assume someone's DNA. You can't go up to a person and say, here, spit in this cup for me so I can carry it around and pretend to be you for the next few minutes. It's not going to happen. So moving on to some more refutation. Okay, no thank you. Okay, Aaliyah got up here and talked about how everyone can be a criminal. I am offended at this because not all of us can be criminals. Let's hold some standards. Let's go back to idealism that this country was built upon. Let's not resort to cynicism and false beliefs and just terrible cynicism. Okay, no thank you. Okay, now moving on, talked about, basically Aaliyah got up here and she basically resorted to fear-mongering, how we have serial violators, serial murders, serial rapists, serial foods, no, kidding. But anyway, you have all these serial people, and the point is, if they're serial criminals, they're already in the system. So that violates that basically negates her whole argument about these serial perpetrators. If they're serial, it means they've been caught and convicted of a crime. So clearly, okay, no, thank you. Okay, and she talks about how terrorism undermines the social structure and living in fear. But again, we're going to be living in fear. The level of anxiety in this country is going to go up when we have this database of DNA, which is really unwarranted. That's how we're going to be living in fear, Mr. Speaker. That's where it's going to come from. No, thank you. And again, just to extend upon some points that the first opposition brought up, DNA is not infallible because, as I mentioned, it's so easy to take a hair off a brush and go plant it on a crime scene, or it's so easy just to do that. So it's not infallible. And to justify this very bold move, it needs to be infallible. And clearly that is not the case. The ends do not justify the means, because this is a gross violation of bodily rights, as we've seen, okay? But most importantly, no thank you. Most importantly, what will this do? It will encourage law enforcement to do better work. They'll be able to use their minds now. They're not automatically going to look around for DNA, which could have been there for days, months, or years. They're going to think and rationalize, who is this person? Why was this crime committed against them? Who are the people in their lives? We need to have a return to logic and law enforcement. Recapping what we've told you, going over our extension, we're doing the terrorist bidding because we're taking away the very freedoms they hate so much, and moreover, we're violating the multiculturalism that we hold so important in this country. And realize the refutations we've done over the whole government, second government company talked about identity theft. But again, we told you, this really does not relate to it. And again, the more access you have to this DNA, the more likely it is to get stolen. It's just a simple matter of proportion. And realize the fact that they come up here and they give false examples like passports. And again, we showed you because they're easy to forge. It has nothing to do with criminals. The movie and how everyone can be a criminal, and that's just a ridiculous statement. You can't believe that. Look to our extension. Look to the fact that we're doing the bidding of the terrorists. And we must uphold civil liberties, and we must uphold reliable technology. So please go into opposition.
Thank the Speaker very much for his remarks. I now call on the final speaker for the government bench to close out today's government case.
Ladies and gentlemen, our criminal justice system, unfortunately as it stands, is in many cases unjust. It's plagued, in many cases, by prejudiced agendas, racial profiling, and appearance-based accusations, and these problems are tending increasingly to replace hard evidence, and well-meaning officials are often, more and more often, tending on their own particular biases as opposed to the use of empirical data to accuse people of being criminals. We see this in the case of Middle Eastern Americans and African Americans especially, as well as Hispanic Americans, which is something I'm going to talk about more a little bit. But and so at this time, and in addition to this, we also see a specter of identity theft, which is something I'm going to crystallize a little bit more because I think it was misinterpreted a little bit by side opposition. So, and by creating a database of DNA for all citizens, we will in fact solve for both of these problems, at least partially. And so I'm going to break down the debate into kind of two sections. The first half, the top of the table, spoke about the right to privacy and whether or not we're violating the right to privacy by doing this. The second half of the debate spoke a little bit about the problems we fix and an issue that I feel very strongly about, which is the issue of partial success, which is something that I'm going to use to explain why, in fact, side government solves more than side opposition does. But I'm going to begin first by refuting the statements of the previous speaker, because there's some things we need to get to. So first of all, he came up here and said that the terrorists we're afraid of hate us for our freedoms, and we're doing their bidding by taking freedoms away. But I'd like to point out that the freedoms that the terrorists oppose us having are the right to vote, the right to speak freely, the right to practice a religion of our choice. It's not the right to withhold a piece of hair or a cheek swab from the government that is causing terrorists to plot against America. It's simply absurd to suggest that this is the case. And then he went on to say that, well, DNA databases don't work anyway because people can plant DNA, which of course is the case, which is why the top of the table made it incredibly clear that it needs to be used in tandem with other evidence. Solely because your DNA is found at the scene of crime does not mean you will be convicted of that crime. It's simply a piece of evidence which will be presented in a court of law along with all the other information, that's available. Then he went on to say that, well, if we create a government database, then government officials have access to people's identities, and they will in fact steal people's identities, which seems sort of like a incredibly suspicious approach to take to the government, that in fact government officials will be stealing citizens' identities, I think at risk of potential punishment for their employers and things. This is unlikely to occur. And then he went on to say, this really crystallized points, that you can't assume someone's DNA. It's very hard to get someone to spit in a cup and carry it around all the time, which is exactly the point we're trying to make. If you can't assume someone's DNA, then DNA confirms objectively that a person is who he or she says he is, which is something that's very important. Yes, sir?
Well, then how can my semen in a jar solve for terrorism and racism?
Well, sir, here's the point. The problem is that in many cases, people, and I'm going to speak about this more, people are accused of being potential criminals solely even because of their names. A popular example, I remember, is, say, Cat Stevens, who's changed his name to Yusuf Islam, was stopped in an airport the other day because he had the same name as someone on a no-fly list. If they had a DNA database, they would show that he was not, in fact, the same person as the person on the no-fly list, and he would not have been accused on a racist and religiously biased basis. So that would solve for that problem. And then his last point was that this encourages law enforcement to do better work by not providing them with all the appropriate resources to do their jobs. That seems like an inappropriate way of asking law enforcement that they have to work hard because we're not giving them all the evidence. It seems unreasonable and absurd to suggest that that's true. But now I'd like to speak about a little bit about the top of the table and how they talk about right to privacy and prove that this does not in fact violate a person's right to privacy because DNA does not fall into the realm of privacy. It does not, because what happened is they came up here and said that DNA does not show what you're doing, it simply shows who you are. But all side opposition said is, this is like Roe v. Wade, this is like, this or whatever, that's all about action. DNA is not about action, it's about your biological identity, not the kind of person who you are. And then there was a point raised by the first speaker in the opposition, which has not been rebutted, and I feel it needs to be rebutted at this point. She pointed out that illegal immigrants will not be included in this database, which is true, but we will know that the motion says all citizens, and the notion that she presented that we don't solve anything because illegal immigrants probably commit most of the crimes anyway is an unacceptable view to hold, and it's something that we can't stand for. So, then we got to talk about a little bit more about what they said about the right to privacy and how we're preemptively dealing with a problem here. I'm pretty proud that everyone possesses the capacity to commit a crime. Everyone possesses the capacity. That doesn't mean everyone will, doesn't mean everyone has the intention to, but you and I and everyone in this room possesses the capacity to commit a violent crime or otherwise. And we're preventing that from happening. And by doing so, we're not, in fact, violating anyone's right to privacy because we're not watching what they're doing. No one is asking what you're doing, what your habits are, where you're going on a daily basis. All it is who, in fact, you are, which is something that's very important to crystallize. Now, to move on to the problems that we solve on our side of the table. We talked about identity theft, and there was a legitimate point raised by side opposition. How's this going to prevent someone on the internet from stealing your credit card? And it won't, obviously. But listen. We need to be pleased with the principle of partial success, and what we can prevent is serious criminals who commit very serious crimes from actually assuming identities of other people, which is something that happens on a regular basis, especially with terror suspects in the United States. They present themselves as identities of people who have died, of people who have left the country. They oftentimes assume their driver's license, their identities, and enroll in social programs, and this will prevent that from happening. So in this way, no thank you, in this way we prevent identity theft. Then we spoke about racial profiling, and I think this is very clear how our system is blind, whereas your system relies on bias and prejudice, unfortunately, because DNA is a blind and objective measure of who a person is, and who was in fact at the scene of a crime, and does not suggest that because someone looks a certain way or is of a certain ancestry, that they might be more potentially involved, have greater potential to be involved in a crime. So to reiterate briefly before I sum up, what we addressed today was, one, that this does not in fact violate a right to privacy because it does not in fact follow what you are doing, where you are, what your habits are, what your actions are. It simply is your biological identity, which is something that is reasonable for the government to ascertain, especially in a situation where people are oftentimes stealing identities. Then we spoke about how we can at least partially combat the threat of identity theft and that of racial profiling, which is greater than the solvency that side opposition gives you. In fact, they give you no solvency. They just say that we need to continue. In fact, they even say that we might need to bar police from accessing certain resources because it will force them to think harder. And we simply can't stand for this. For those reasons, we're proud of it. Thank you.
I thank the speaker very much for his remarks. The chair now recognizes the final speaker of today's semifinal debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for giving me the floor. So we've had a really exciting debate today, and I'm probably going to sum up it very cleverly and probably see if which side you would go for. So so there's some questions that we have to ask ourselves. So if the model that they're putting forth if it is really necessary. Secondly, if it is really going to work, and thirdly, if it really does have any benefits. So what we've heard is that it's a preemptive measure, and also it's also going to let us find criminals. So the speaker that just was here, for the government side, said a couple of things that I want to mention. He said that it does have partial success, and then he says DNA is blind, so it's not racist. Well, I mean, for those things necessarily you have to think about it. What we're talking about here today is violating our privacy of all the citizens of the United States. And as an POI, I ask, is it necessary? I mean, shouldn't we have a foolproof method? Only then should we violate the rights of our citizens. Only then. But if it is only going to give us partial success, and it is blind, which it doesn't know if somebody else put the DNA, and then then why? Then he says it's also, DNA is not the end and all. It's not the only aspect that will tell us who did the crime, but it's a part of the investigation. Because when Michael pointed out that police officers would rely too much on DNA, but he said it's only part. So that we have to think about it, how it's not unnecessary it is, because it's only a part of the investigation, and it's partially successful, and it is blind. And it may or may not work. So keeping all of those things in mind, do we really want to violate the physical privacy of all the citizens in America? Furthermore, as my partner pointed out, fingerprint. We've had fingerprinting technology for almost 100 years, but we haven't fingerprinted all the citizens in the United States. No, we haven't. We've only fingerprinted the criminals, them, because they have given up their right to privacy when they do something like that. And as Aaliyah pointed out, the people who commit a crime, they're more susceptible to committing a crime. So those are the only ones who should legally be giving up that right. So fingerprinting, why haven't we made everyone give their fingerprints in the United States? Because we know that we have given these rights to our citizens, and as when we were told that, well, terrorists hate our freedom and our freedom of speech and our freedom of press and freedom to gather, they also hate our freedom to privacy, which we have given to our citizens, which we live on. So they do also hate that. So we are violating the rights of the privacy rights of our citizens right now. So we have to go back and look at the fear-mongering aspect of it. They keep telling us, well, if we have this, we might actually stop some terrorists. And first they say it's preemptive, and then they say, well, it'll help us find terrorists. So I have to point to this one aspect. They said they're going to get a DNA of all the citizens of the United States. Well, you know who else are in the United States? There are also people who come in, all the terrorists, the terrorist attacks we have had on our soil, none of them were citizens. They all either had a green card or they were here on a visiting visa or any other kind of visa. I'm standing here with an Afghan passport. I'm not a citizen yet. Next year, hopefully, fingers crossed. But so I'm not going to be in it. And apparently, all Middle Easterners are probably under the cast of suspicion. Well, they're not going to take my DNA test. And then they says, oh, DNA doesn't tell us what you're going to do. Well, if it's not, then why should we? This is why we have allowed phone tapping. Phone tap, because it's separate. It's not physical violation of our privacy, okay? And which is probably more effective. Then why, if something that they say is partially successful, is blind, and is only a small part of investigation, so for that kind of, why should we violate the rights of all the citizens of the United States for that kind of thing? So we should, summarizing, as we've pointed out, terrorists do hate our freedom, and we are doing terrorist bidding, as Michael pointed out. Second, there is a culture violation. How are we gonna justify to all the different cultures across America that this is something that we need? They keep telling me that the ends justify the means, but you'll make the Amish take their...
A 9-year-old girl died 2 weeks ago because her parents wouldn't take her to the hospital because they don't believe in medical technology. And what is the government doing? They are prosecuting the parents for this action. We believe that in some cases religious rights are not above the rights of the citizens.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to use children's example and have the guilt factor. So I'll use a children's example too. So they said, well, when you go back, kids who are born will take their DNA samples, and people who have the licenses, when they're going to go renew it, they're going to get their DNA tested too. So people who are under 18, 10-year-old Johnny, okay, well, his parent will probably have to take him to a DNA center where his DNA will be taken. Little Johnny asks his dad, Dad, why am I going to the DNA center? Johnny, because we need their DNA because maybe you might grow up into a criminal. Because they said everyone has the capacity to become a criminal. But Daddy, I'm a nice kid. You think I'm a nice kid? Why am I going to do that? But you might, because the government thinks everyone has the capacity to become a criminal. I mean, if you're going to use children, you can use it on both sides. So all they're doing is fear-mongering, putting the guilt, using guilt, like religious sects, and using and telling me that it's not going to work. Thirdly, it's ineffective, as I've pointed out, what they've said themselves. Anything comes up and gives us a Cat Stevens example of use of Islam, okay? It's more ineffective when it comes to terrorism because, as I've pointed out, most of the terrorists, all of the terrorists, almost all of them are not American citizens. What about international terrorists? Use of Islam, yes, he's on the no-fly list, but that other use of Islam is Egyptian. And you don't have his DNA. So this is not going to work. How are they going to stop terrorism? Thirdly, we have the identity theft, which still don't know how it works. Because how are you going to find? I mean, physically you have to present yourself all the time. So DNA, no one can see it. I don't really want to waste time on that one. It doesn't tie into this. So we have to sum up what we have today. Does the system work? Is it necessary? And is it worth violating our rights? And we've shown it's not necessary because it's only a part of the investigation which may or may not work, which is blind and is partially successful, as they've pointed out. It's not worth, for all those reasons, it's not worth violating all the rights, physical privacy rights of all the citizens of America. Thirdly, it's not successful, as they pointed out, because if they don't do it all over the world, there's no way it's going to help stop terrorism. So for all those reasons I've cited, there's no reason for us to violate all the rights of all of our citizens because we will be violating their physical privacy, and which will be terribly wrong. So thank you for your...
I invite all competitors to cross-shake hands, and then I would request that everyone, including the audience, quickly vacate the room.